a poem by William Wordsworth called Lines Written in Early Spring. So today we're going to talk about William Blake, but before we do, we're going to talk about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So we're going to talk about the poem, we're going to hear the poem read, called Frost at Midnight. So that was on your very first handout, because we didn't get to it. So we're just kind of a little bit behind. Here is the poem up here, and you should have a copy of it as well. And I should have a copy if this is working. You should be able to hear a contemporary poet by the name of Forrest Gander read this poem. Forrest Gander is a very fine poet and translator. And this was a project where contemporary poets would read poems by Romantic era authors, but I'm missing it somehow. I know it's here because I tried it to make sure that the link was still working. Where is it? There's all kinds of interesting things on here. You can see basically my life and my son's life, who spends part of his time on my iPad. But I'm not seeing it right off the top of my head. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and do it this way. So I'm going to do this so that you can see this site, okay? It's called Romantic Circles, Poets on Poets. I'm an editor of part of this, not the Poets on Poets part, because that's no longer working, but the Romantic Circles, I'm an editor of one of their many journal segments. But Romantic Circles, RC Audio, let's go ahead and search for there he is. He reads Frost at Midnight. So let's hear Forrest Gander read this poem. I don't think it's a great reading or anything. I just like having somebody else read it. Also, I want to give you permission to read the poems aloud. It's really helpful to be able to get a sense of the poems by hearing them read aloud.
Frost at midnight. The frost performs its secret ministry unhelped by any wind. The owlet's cry came loud, and hark again, loud as before. The inmates of my cottage all at rest have left me to that solitude which suits abstruser musings, save that at my side my cradled infant slumbers peacefully. 'Tis calm indeed, so calm that it disturbs and vexes meditation with its strange and extreme silence. Sea, hill, and wood, this populous village. Sea and hill and wood, with all the numberless goings-on of life, inaudible as dreams. The thin blue flame lies on my low-burnt fire and quivers not. Only that film which fluttered on the grate still flutters there, the sole unquiet thing. Methinks its motion in this hush of nature gives it dim sympathies with me who live, making it a companionable form, whose puny flaps and freaks the idling spirit, by its own moods interprets everywhere echo or mirror seeking of itself, and makes a toy of thought. Though, how oft at school with most believing mind, presageful, I have gazed upon the bars to watch that fluttering stranger, and as oft, with unclosed lids, already had I dreamt of my sweet birthplace in the old church tower, whose bells, the poor man's only music, rang from morn to evening all the hot fair day, so sweetly that they stirred and haunted me, with a wild pleasure falling on my ear. most like articulate sounds of things to come. So gazed I, till the soothing things I dreamt lulled me to sleep, and sleep prolonged my dreams. So I brooded all the following morn, awed by the stern preceptor's face, mine eye fixed with a mock study on my swimming boat, save as the door half opened and I snatched a hasty glance, and still my heart leaped up, for still I hoped to see the stranger's face, townsman or aunt or sister more beloved, my playmate, when we both were clothed alike. Dear babe, that sleepest cradled by my side, whose gentle breathings, heard in this deep calm, fill up the interspersed vacancies and momentary pauses of the thought. My babe, so beautiful it thrills my heart, with tender gladness thus to look at thee, and think that thou shalt learn far other love, and in far other scenes. For I was reared in the great city, pent mid cloisters dim, and saw not lovely but the sky and stars. But thou, my babe, shalt wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountain, and beneath the clouds, which image in their bulk both lakes and shores and mountain crags. So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who from eternity doth teach himself in all, and all things in himself, great universal teacher. You shall mold thy spirit, and by giving thee ask. Therefore all seasons shall be sweet to thee, whether the summer clothe the general earth with greenness, or the red grass sit and sing betwixt the tufts of snow on the bare branch of mossy apple tree, while the nigh thatch smokes in the sun thaw, whether the eve drops fall, heard only in the trances of the glass. Let this secret ministry of frost shall hang them up in silent icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon.
Okay. Thank you, Forrest Gander, for that reading. So, again, here's the poem. I want to point out one problem with the way Poetry Foundation has reproduced the poem for us. It makes a mistake in that this but O, I know it just seems random where it's placed. It's not here at the beginning of the line, you see. It should actually be here. Move down one line, but it should continue this line. Do you see what I'm saying? It's called a hemistitch. And the poet use it to break a line in the middle and create meaning that continues across but also is changed. Do you know what I mean? You have to think of it like, think of what the poet is trying to do as being really similar to what a filmmaker is trying to do. The filmmaker is trying to give you like a shot and then another shot and a kind of transition between the two, but he wants to. So if you were counting lines, which you might do if you were writing about this poem, you might say in line 19, Coleridge says blah, 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 blah. But you know what? This is all one line. Makes a toy of thought, but oh, how oft. Okay? So again, I told you last time that this is written in iambic pentameter. So if we count syllables, makes a toy of thought, but oh, how oft. So it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 syllables. So what that means is it's short a syllable. It's missing this first syllable. This doesn't matter. This is like I'm not gonna grade you on your scansion. Like this is called scansion. I teach this stuff in my intro to poetry class. So take that class. It's fun, and you get to write poems and read them and so forth. But this first part is missing. But the whole point is just when you're reading, don't be confused if somebody reproduces it incorrectly. You can impress your friends by saying that's called a hemistitch. It continues on the same line. It's all one line. Isn't that cool? So that's the way it works. But it's the poet's way of being able to Do you see? Because the poem does change mood there. It changes the scene all of a sudden. In fact, there are kind of three parts to the poem. So before I say anything else, does anybody have any questions or comments about the poem or the reading of the poem? Did anybody notice that he read the wrong word?
Yes.
Yes. He read the word love instead of the word lore. It's a very interesting substitution because it's a very loving poem, but lore is a very different kind of word. Lore means history or culture, right? So it's a very different kind of thing to say. But I think he's right to intuit that that word love is kind of hiding in the word lore. But that's the only, I think, mistake that he made. Anybody else on a word you don't know? Abstruser? Who knows what abstruser means? Yes? It means obscure, yes. Obscure and almost kind of like purposefully obscure. An abstruse thought is one kind of almost like a dreamy, obscure thought. The way I think about this poem very often is that this is a poem written right when you're almost falling asleep, and you're in that kind of dreamy state, right? So there's a lot of dreaminess in this poem like that. Okay, what about what was the other word that presageful? Does anybody know what a presage is? It's like a forethought or a forefeeling. Like when I think something's going to happen. What's that called? An intuition or something like that? It's like that. So I had a presage that you might show up at class late or something like that. It's sort of anticipating something coming forward. So anticipating is, I think what he means there is with anticipation I gaze. But he's kind of playing with language. And by the way, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the author of this poem, who was besties with William Wordsworth, he invented more words in the Oxford English Dictionary than any other person. So he's a big inventor of words. We call them neologisms, where you make up a word. Because he's writing a poem and he goes, well, there's no proper word for this, so I'll make one up. Like psychoanalysis is a word that he made up. Not in a poem, but in his theoretical writing. Okay. All right. So I said that last time when we looked at the poem Lines Written in Early Spring by William Wordsworth. You remember? I heard 1,000 blended notes while in a grove I sat reclined in that sweet mood which pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. I said that poem was chock full of romantic ideas that we were going to unpack during this semester, and during especially this period where we focus on Romanticism before we go to Victorianism and then Modernism and then post-war British poetry. And I said nature was a really big thing. Remember, we talked about what man has made of man. You sort of have the natural man, and then you have sort of like man in society and what happens to man in society when he organizes himself, or we organize ourselves into these groups, what happens. This poem has another aspect of the romantic in it, and that is this focus on childhood. Childhood, memory, and the domestic sphere. So it's not. It hasn't always been the case in the world that people sort of organize themselves into these families and raise children in this way. In fact, it was a relatively recent development that you would pay this much attention to a child. And the reason is kind of complicated. One is that you would only do it if you were from a wealthy family, because otherwise that child is really just a proto grown-up. You're waiting for it to be 8 or 9 years old till it can go out and work in the fields. And then it's just another worker, right? It doesn't have this kind of like, oh, wonderful childhood. You know, it doesn't mean people didn't love their children and didn't have this feeling for them, but it basically means that you had to be of a certain class position in order for that to be a possibility. Otherwise, basically that was just a worker waiting to happen and then take over the role of the father or the grandfather in running that farm or doing whatever it was doing, whatever industry that was in. So with industrial capitalism and with the burgeoning sort of market economy means that it's possible for us to begin to have this idea of the nuclear family that we now know and love so well, right? So I don't know if how you feel about that, but Coleridge is one of these writers right at the cusp of this happening. And in fact, he's a very ambivalent father. It's a long story, but he was pretty much he himself was an orphan, which you can hear in the middle part of this poem. He himself was an orphan, so he spent some time at Cambridge after being in the orphanage. He was really brilliant. He went immediately to Cambridge, and then he basically just went off on a drinking spree and left and wandered around and did all kinds of things, including preaching. He was only 21 years old. You could kind of walk into a town and go to the church and say, you know, can I do a sermon? And they say, okay. And he'd go up and do a sermon. And his sermons were pretty radical because he was basically promoting abolition of the slave trade, a kind of sympathy for the French Revolution and for democracy. I mean, he was radical about his feeling about abolition for the slave trade. He talked about a sugar boycott. Why a sugar boycott? And he would say every time you put sugar in your tea, you're putting blood in your tea. You're putting the blood of Africans in your tea every time you do that. Why? Because sugar was being grown in the colonies and shipped back to England to put in your tea or coffee. And he was saying we need to boycott that so that we can end the slave trade. And this was like in the 1790s. So he was pretty much of a radical, and so it's a long story, but he had this idea that he would start a commune in America with his friend Robert Southey, who's also a great Romantic era poet, and they would live in this commune, and everybody would do all the work. The women wouldn't have to do too much work. We would all do the same amount of work, and we basically, you know, philosophize and grow vegetables and olive and everything like this. The problem was he was not at all a very pragmatic person. He was basically very soon became addicted to opium and was not a very pragmatic person. And even though he had this great idea, it fell through for all kinds of reasons. But he had already, God, this is such a long story. I can't believe I'm telling you. The reason he's married to this woman, Sarah, and he had this baby, is because Southey married her sister. And he said, oh, I should marry the sister so we can all go live in America. You know, which is not to say he didn't love Sarah Fricker, but the only reason he married her was to get, and then Southey's like, oh no, I'm not going to America. You know, like, he's like, oh, but I married the sister. And then she's pregnant. Guess what? You know, which happened back then, right? That's what happened back then more. So like, what am I gonna do? You know, I've got this. And so what he decided, I think, not consciously, but what I feel in this poetry, is he took all that revolutionary feeling and channeled it into this kind of domestic scene. So that the cottage, this little domestic scene, is now infused with a utopian purpose and idea of raising this child that will be the kind of prototype for what a good citizen would be, what a good human being would be, what a good poet, person would be. Do you see how this works? He channeled all of that energy of this failed utopian thing into his poetry and his philosophical thought. He was a really brilliant speaker. Many people say he was the most amazing person to actually hear speak, because he could go from talking about German abstract philosophy to mathematics to chemistry to poetry. He pretty much could do all of it. But this poem is about this. All right. So again, can we talk about the structure for 1 second? Do you remember what kind of poem I said this was?
Iambic pentameter.
Iambic pentameter. What's the genre?
Romantic ode.
And a romantic ode. Excellent. It's a romantic ode. And so basically that means it has sort of usually 3 parts. And you can think of this as sort of like no, actually, wait a minute, I'm wrong about that. I would say it's this is the whole first part goes, oops, stop. This whole first part goes from here to here. The second part goes, I have to go to the other page, hold on, to here. And the third part starts, dear babe, asleep as cradle at my side. Okay, so the structure is basically the terms are the Greek terms are strophe, antistrophe, and epode, but that they basically mean something like turn, counter-turn, and stand, like in a dance. So it's turn, counter-turn, and then back and stand. So the way to understand this is that the romantic ode deals with a problem. That's the first section, a problem of some sort. The second part involves some kind of either philosophizing or memory or flight of the imagination, some kind of working out of that problem. And the third part comes back to the initial problem, but with something changed. So it comes back, and I would call it a partial resolution. I'm really against this idea that there's a full kind of resolution at the end of these poems. It's a kind of partial resolution, enough for you to kind of move forward. So in this poem, I think the problem really is he's looking at this baby, he's thinking about, and I've actually been to this cottage, it's in Nether Stowey in the west of England, right? He's thinking about his baby, and he's the only one awake, and he's hearing his baby sleep next to him. His wife is probably next to him over here and asleep. And probably knowing Coleridge, there are several, poets downstairs drunk asleep, somewhere. And he's thinking, wow, he's not really aware what the problem is. But he focuses on something, and what he focuses on, and he steals this actually from another poem. To be a great artist is to be a great thief, right? You steal from other people, right? So he stole this from a poem called The Task by William Cowper, although it's spelled Cowper, 18th century poet. But basically, he looks at the fire, and he sees the little things flying off the fire, and that becomes a trigger for him to go into a memory or a reverie. And that memory or reverie, but oh, how oft at school, with most believing mind presageful, have I gazed upon the bars, right? He's suddenly back at Christ Church School in London, where he was sent to be an orphan. He was an orphan, his father died, but we were sent to go to school. And the one great saving grace for Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Charles Lamb and other Romantic era writers who were sent there as indigent or poor kids, the one great saving grace was they had an amazing English professor there who really cared about these kids and taught them the classics and taught them Latin and Greek. And it turned out that Coleridge was a brilliant Latinist and scholar of Greek and was a great poet and could just, boom, pick these things up immediately. Read Scottish philosophy, boom, got it right away, So this part, he's remembering being back at school. But yet there's another farther back memory. of looking at the fire when he was home before his father died. So he keeps imagining this stranger, which is both a kind of fantastic, angel figure or spiritual figure, but it's also maybe his sister, or maybe it's his aunt, right, who he hasn't seen since he's been in London. So he goes back and he relives this memory, and something about the reliving of the memory allows him to come back and be more present with his child, right? Because the only mention of the child in the first section, the first strophe, the only mention of the child is "Save for at my side my cradled infant slumbers peacefully," right? Isn't that something like that? So that's the only mention. But then it comes back, and he says, immediately addresses the child. When you address someone in a poem, and you do it in the middle of the poem, it's called an apostrophe, right? And you're right to say that this word strophe is in there, right? But it's apostrophe, which means to turn away. If strophe means turn, it means to turn away. So you turn away from the direct address to us, the reader, and suddenly address the baby. So here's a question, and I want you to think about this and try to answer it if you can. What does it mean to address directly a sleeping infant who, even if it was awake, couldn't understand what you're saying? Do you see what I'm saying? It's like, I do it all the time. I talk to my dog, but and I talk to my children when they were little babies. But what does that? How do you understand that kind of speech? Yes.
I think individually, like this poem, in this case, it's almost like he's making a vow to his child.
Right. Right.
That his child won't have the same childhood,
right,
and that he won't have the same kind of life.
Promise. He makes a promise or a vow, and that means that he has to do what temporality are we in? So we start in the present, right? Frost performs its secret ministry. That first line of the poem is in present tense. The frost performs, not the frost performed, but the frost performs. We're in the present tense. Then but oh, how oft did I do this? Now we're in the past. And then we jump forward, and now he takes a vow. What tense are we in now? Future, right, exactly. He's suddenly able to imagine the future. Then it becomes clear what the problem was in the first place. The problem was, look, I'm not a very good dad. He actually says this in some poems. I don't think I'm going to be very good at this. Most of my skills are in drinking and writing poems and such. I'm not really good at being there. But he is able to imagine a future by making this vow that his son will not grow up in an orphanage somewhere. And he did send money, as much money as he could, back to his family, even though he didn't really spend much time with them. He had 4 kids, 1 died, so he had 3 kids. Right. So it's a promise or vow. What else would you say is sort of there in that kind of, what does it mean to speak to a sleeping child as though it could hear you? I don't really know the answer to this. I've written a whole chapter of a book about this question. I don't really know the answer to it. It's weird. Yes?
Does it maybe comfort yourself?
That was what I was thinking, something like that. That there's something about this being a healing kind of moment for the self, in a way, right? Who's a parent in here? Anyone? Okay, me. Okay, I'm a parent. I will tell you that part of what you do, for good or bad, is to project your own problems onto your kids, and then hope that they will somehow work them out, and somehow that will sort of make you feel better about your past. It doesn't really work that way. You just torture them with your bullshit. But that's the idea. The idea is that you will somehow, it's well-meaning. You care about, you love them, but they're like, yeah, I'm a separate person. Thank you very much. I'm my own person. But a little baby can't do that. Can you imagine? Hey, chill, man, I'm okay. I actually like the city, you know, like, whatever. But you can't do that. So I think there is something here. There's a promise which means the future, and then there's some kind of healing, which is in the past. Right? I think that's you've got the structure there. I think that's part of the structure. And then he's able to say all those things about, thou my babe shall learn far other lore. You won't be like me growing up in the cities. You're going to be able to run free in nature. Now I want you to get the way he figures nature here. It's a little different than the way Wordsworth does. The way he figures nature is in a series of reflections and mirrorings. So let me just read those sections for you, because I think they're very important to understand the way nature functions for the romantic imagination. It's a little bit different than it was in Wordsworth. Do you remember in Wordsworth, the reflection had to do with a kind of philosophical problem? Like, is there pleasure in nature? And if there's pleasure in nature, there must be pleasure in humanity, and we must stop this problem of creating more and more pain. We must somehow ease people's pleasure and suffering. There's too much suffering in the world on account of the fact that we've lost connection to this natural world. That's Wordsworth's thing. Coleridge's is a little different. Listen, he says, thou, my babe, shall wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountain, and beneath the clouds which image in their bulk both lakes and shores and mountain crags. So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language, which thy God utters, who from eternity doth teach himself in all and all things in himself. So first of all, much more theological language. You hear it? Much more religious language here, right? And the way that it works is, and he writes about this elsewhere. He writes about this in a text called Opus Maximum. He's thinking about the way in which the Father is really the earthly representative of God. Which, women, you're free to whatever, This is the way he sees it, right? The Father is the earthly representative of God, but the Father is limited where God is unlimited. And there's a mirroring there that happens between the Father and God, and there's a mirroring that happens between the lake and the clouds. You see how that works? And the clouds image themselves in the lake, and the lake reflects the clouds. So God reflects himself in us, we reflect ourselves in God. It's okay if I'm not the perfect parent, because guess who's the perfect parent? God, the only perfect parent. That part, even though I'm not sure I believe in God, I kind of do, kind of don't, that part is true. That if there is a perfect parent, it's not me. Believe me. Mistake after mistake after mistake. Okay, so if there is a perfect parent, it's God. So you see how he works this out. And you see that mirroring again at the very end of the poem. Listen. Quietly shining to the quiet moon. Right? Again, two icicles reflecting one another, quietly shining to the quiet moon. I guess they're not reflecting one another, they're reflecting the moon. Okay, any questions about this poem? Do you see why it's so important? Why these two poems, I hold these two poems as kind of touchstones for us. I think that they are really, really important poems for us. Questions or comments? Again, to keep the same thing, these two guys, we'll come back to it a little bit next time, but these two guys worked on this book called Lyrical Ballads. And their idea, Wordsworth and Coleridge collaborated on it. Their idea, this poem wasn't in it just because of ridiculous reasons. It just didn't make it in there, just because it got published somewhere else. But the idea was to bring, remember, high art and low art together. The ballad form, which is a low art, and lyrical feeling, which is kind of like poetic lyricism, bring them together, and that's what he's doing. Same thing here. Write a romantic ode, not about some battle, not about some king, whatever, but about a little sleeping baby. And don't use any rhyme. In fact, it was so beautifully tossed off that he wrote it in a letter. I'm very jealous of this kind of poet that can just do this, right? I mean, he's just writing a letter, and he just writes this poem down, sends it off, and then he publishes. That's most of his poems are written initially as letters to people, and letters to people. So do you see that high and low form coming together? Okay. Any questions about any of that? I got like super excited talking about Coleridge for a second. I mean, he was my favorite when I was, well, a little older than you. This poem is probably responsible for me becoming a romanticist rather than working on modernist poetry. It's just this poem, because it just was so weird and beautiful. And I had a little baby at the time, so that's why. All right. We're going to turn now to somebody very different. So let me say a couple things here before we do. Let me say something about two generations of Romantic poets. So pay attention, because this is important. We've met all the first generation now, wait, let me say this. There's way more poets in the first and second generation than the ones we'll cover in this class. Take a Romanticism class with me, and we'll read Southey, we'll read many other different poets, but we'll read Charlotte Smith, we'll read all of them, right? But we're focusing mostly on 3 or 4 here. The first generation is William Wordsworth, who we've already encountered, but I'm sorry to say we will, I don't know if you're sorry, but we're going to encounter him more. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And remember that these two guys together wrote the lyrical ballads. They published it anonymously when they first wrote it. There's William Blake, who we will talk about today, who didn't know these guys at all. And he's a kind of outlier for a lot of different reasons. We're going to talk a little bit about Charlotte Smith today. Just one poem, I think. And there are several others that we won't have time to focus on at all. And this is the first generation of Romantic poets. So what does it mean to be in the first generation? I'm basically saying, let's call this 1789 to 1810. Okay? Second generation, we're obviously like any good, you notice this if you follow music, right? They're responding to the first generation. They're trying to change or do something different or better than the first generation. And these are John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Lord Byron, and I'm going to put John Clare in here because we're going to focus on him a little bit. And their dates more or less go from 18, I'm going to put 1810, although it's kind of silly because only Byron had published by then. Shelley in 1810 was probably only 13 or 14 years old. And Byron published when he was 16 or something. Keats dies in 20. Byron dies in 24, 25, and Shelley dies in 22, and Clare is institutionalized by the mid-20s. So let's just say 1830. But with the idea that the real focus of their bright period, which burned really hot and fast, was from 1815 to 1822. Bam, that's when Shelley was alive and writing and notorious. We'll get to them after Frankenstein. So we're going to do more of the first generation, then we'll do Frankenstein, which features, by the way, of course, it's written by the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley. And no. She is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. That's okay. Lord Byron does fit in there somewhere. Lord Byron had a child with her stepsister. Lord Byron and Shelley had lots of flings. They had lots of, I don't know what to call them. Let's go back to Blake. So Blake is truly an individual. So, I know what I'm going to do. Hold on one second. So do you ever get really clever with your passwords? It's not a good idea. Here we go. Okay, we're going to look at the William Blake archive for a second, just so I can show you. All right. So did anybody get a chance to look at this? All right, this is the way to actually look at these poems, all right? So what we're going to do is we're going to find songs of innocence and songs of experience. Work. Let's see. I'm going to do that. No, let's see that. Just want to make it bigger. It's not that big. All right, let's do this. All right, here's the frontispiece to Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. So William Blake. Wish I could tell you his exact dates. I'm not exactly sure of them. Is that okay that way? I think you can see a little better. William Blake, born much earlier than these other guys. Well, not much earlier, maybe 10, 20 years earlier than these other guys. So I think he's like 1770s, something like that, maybe, something like that. He is, by the time he does Songs of Innocence and Experience, he's like 30. He was he only had an 8th grade education, lived in London, grew up in London, was apprenticed to an engraver when he was 13. So he liked to draw, so he was apprenticed to an engraver. He grew up with Christian radical parents, Unitarians, who for that time in London were pretty to the left. His Christian beliefs were way to the left of theirs. They were, so even they were not radical enough for Blake. Let's see, some of the things that you can think about with Blake. You might want to write this down. Blake said, "I must invent my own system or be a slave to another man's." I must invent my own system or be a slave to another man's. And so you can see how what Blake is trying to do is something radically different. So what did he do? He wrote these poems after working as an engraver and learning from looking at biblical manuscripts mostly. He discovered there was this rich history and this way to make art that other people weren't doing. And they're called illuminated books. So they bring together the visual and the textual. They bring together the poem and the image. And they don't treat them as separate objects at all. In fact, he writes his first collection of poems, which were good, but they didn't have any images in them. Then when he does his second, which is just called Songs of Innocence, he does that one first. He does it in 1789. Why is that year important? I'm looking at you for a reason. French Revolution, right? It is the first stage of the French Revolution, the first initial moment, 1789. From 1789, he writes Songs of Innocence. And we're going to look at one of the poems from Songs of Innocence. I will tell you how he writes them, how he composes them. He writes the poems in a journal, in a book. We can go back and read them in his books, just like the kind of bound books we have. What are they called? Moleskin books. They look like a moleskin book or something like that. He writes his poems in there. Then he takes the poem once he's got it the way he wants it, and then he goes and he takes a piece of metal that's about this big. It's a piece of metal and an etching tool. But wait, no. He takes a piece of metal this big, then he takes, before he doesn't do the etching tool anymore. That's what he starts with. He invents his own system. He takes a paintbrush and he dips it into a solution which is acid resistant. Then he draws with his solution everything that you see on any of these plates. So, let's see, how do I get back? He draws each of these things on the plate with an acid resistant substance. Then he bathes the whole plate in acid. It eats away everything except what he's written, which then allows him to ink that plate, run it through a roller between two sheets of paper, and he pulls one sheet of paper off, and there's the print. Then he mixes his own paints, and he hand paints each piece that he does. So you can imagine there's only 20, 30, 40 copies of each book of poems in his lifetime, and only about 20 existing, only a few that are complete. So they're very prized objects now. He was not particularly well known or cared for in his time. As a painter especially, he did these amazing paintings, completely mind-blowing, and completely was snubbed by the Royal Academy in London. They didn't want anything to do with him. He was not the right kind of painter. He was too emotional. Do you guys know what outsider art is? Outsider art is basically a kind of art that really focuses on being real and naive and genuine and raw, as opposed to being really polished and whatever. So, well, Blake is an outsider artist, I think, right? Although he has tremendous skill to be able to do this, right? I want to say one more thing about this process that what really impresses me. He writes all those tiny words like that. He's writing them backwards, right? Because you know what happens when you write something and then you reverse it. It's going to be reversed, so he has to write it backwards. So he's writing in a mirror, right? To do all the writing. So really, really advanced stuff. Okay. So that's just my Blake fanboy coming out. That's like how I feel. I feel like he's amazing. He's like whatever. But the point is that we look back to him now as the thing that is different. If I want to talk about the kind of modes, I would say that Wordsworth is if Wordsworth represents a kind of sort of a voice for everyone, and Coleridge represents kind of a unique view into the psychology of the poem, Blake is a prophet. You see the difference? You have this sort of poet for the people. Wordsworth is sort of the poet for the people. Coleridge is sort of the intensely psychologically complex poet. And then you have the prophet. Three aspects of the romantic that comes out of these poets, right? And And so let's go back and talk about this poem. Let me find first, let me escape somehow. Escape this. I don't want the enlargement anymore. How do I close out of the enlargement?
Just exit out of the page.
Where do you see it?
At the top. Just
At
exit
the
out
top?
of the page.
Hold on. Which one? Here?
The X at the top
That's
right.
that page.
Top right?
Yeah,
Here?
the X.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Excellent. Okay. Let's find the poem we're looking for. This one. Okay. And let's go ahead and get an enlargement of this poem. This is the poem that I had you read for today, Infant Joy. Infant joy and infant sorrow. So let's just deal with Infant Joy, which is a song of innocence, okay? That's what it looks like. I'll go ahead and I'll read from the text that's right here. I have no name. I am but 2 days old. What shall I call thee? I happy am. Joy is my name. Sweet joy befall thee. Pretty joy, sweet joy, but 2 days old. Sweet joy, I call thee. Thou dost smile, I sing the while. Sweet joy befall thee. Okay. In order to kind of get a better understanding just of the verse, let's look at it like this. What do you see that's different between this and the version that we had in the, just a second ago? Did anybody notice any differences? Yes?
The quotation.
Yes, exactly. The editor put the quotation marks in. Thank you, Norton. Thank you. Do I sound sarcastic? I was trying to sound sarcastic. Thank you, Norton editors. Yeah. No, we don't need the quotation marks, right? Because okay, so this is a song of innocence. Now, how do we understand innocence and experience? Let me first start with that. So it's easy to see these things as opposites, but that's not how Blake understands them. In fact, at the very beginning of the frontispiece, I don't know if you noticed it, for Songs of Innocence and Experience, he says, showing the two opposing states of the human soul. So they are, rather than categorical opposites, think of them as opposites in terms of being part of a continuum, right? So the way I think about it, I don't like this pen. The way I think about it is that innocence and experience are two related ways of looking at the same phenomenon. All right. In this case, the phenomena is the phenomena of infancy, birth. A very important, again, romantic theme. Why? Because you don't get born once in this sort of thing. It's a little Christian in that regard. Like you get born many, many, many times. Right? But the infant is the place that you can write about as a metaphor for that continuing process. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. So I have no name. I am but 2 days old. Now you can see why the editors did this. They're trying to help us to understand this weird poem. Right? So when it's in quotations, that's the baby. When it's in no quotations, that's the mommy. Right? I have no name. I am but 2 days old. At which point I would have dropped the child and run out of the room. If the infant started talking to me, I would have said, right? It's Rosemary's Baby. It's very scary. What shall I call thee? I happy am. Joy is my name. Sweet joy befall thee. Pretty joy, sweet joy, but 2 days old. Sweet joy I call thee. Thou dost smile. I sing the while. Sweet joy befall thee. So you have 2 stanzas. That's what these are called. If anybody's confused, these are 2 stanzas. Stanza just means a grouping of lines in a poem. These are 6-line stanzas, which are called sestets, but that's not so important. Sestet. The first one begins with the baby's voice. The second one is all the mother's voice. So if we think about what the baby says, the baby first says, I have no name, I am but 2 days old. Which is probably not, you have to think about what kind of communication this is, right? Blake is imagining innocence as a kind of way of looking at the world that it's a way of looking at the world that takes everything at face value. It doesn't judge. So imagine the least kind of judgmental kind of place. It doesn't mean it's stupid. It's quite the opposite of stupid. It's very, very, it might not know a lot, like it might not know the difference between a piece of paper and a leaf, but it's very smart because it looks at someone and doesn't judge them. It looks at a situation and doesn't judge it. You'll see this in the other poems, but here what you have is, the way I can best talk about this is through a quote from a psychoanalyst named Winnicott, D.W. Winnicott, who said, when you're dealing with the mother with the baby at the mother's breast, when it's that complete enmeshment, it's not appropriate to talk about a mother and a baby. You can only talk about a mother-baby pairing. Do you see what I mean? It doesn't really make sense. There is no separateness in that moment. The very fruit of life is running through both of them. The very connection is running through both of them. And maybe even if they're not feeding, in innocence, there's such immediate connection between the caregiver and the baby that you can communicate. Because, look. What's your name again?
Max.
Max? Max, did you choose that name?
No.
Hell no, you didn't choose that name. What's your name?
Jacob.
Jacob, did you choose Jacob? No, you didn't choose Jacob. Did you choose to be white? No, you didn't choose to be white. You just that's it. We don't get to choose, right? But in innocence, what are you? I'm music. Okay, I'll call you music. Wow. Pretty amazing, right? What am I? I'm running. I'm a runner. Okay, I'm going to call you runner. It's pretty beautiful. What are you? I love to read. Okay, you're a reader. You're the reader. Right? No judgment, no pre-assigned labels, categories, etc. in innocence. Right? And you see how the different sections of the poem, I happy am. This is kind of crazy. Like, first of all, it's a weird kind of inversion. It's what do you call it? Like almost like a Yoda speak, right? I happy am. But look at this. This word is in this word. You see what I'm saying? It's like the very thing that you are. What I am is in my name now. Right? I'm happy. Okay, you are joy. That's what I'm calling you, joy, right? Again, here. It's not like, oh, you like to smile and I like to sing. It's like your smiling and my singing are interrelated. Thou dost smile, I sing the while, right? So it becomes like, does the baby smile because the mother sings, or does the mother sing because the baby smiles? The answer is yes, all of it. It all happens at the same time because there is no separation. Blake here understands that innocence, like, this kind of idea that I really believe, that my well-being is based on your well-being and your well-being and your well-being and your well-being, and we're all kind of connected in this way, and there's really no separation between us except whatever kind of like crazy societal like whatever's we need, and we need a little separation in order to feel safe, because otherwise it gets scary. But mostly I really believe that it's like that. Blake understands that innocence is like that. He understands that it's like that. But he also understands that you can't only live in innocence. But it's not like one is true and one is false. Does that make any sense? They're both kind of like necessary. So we come to the Song of Experience. And the thing to say about the Song of Experience is it's written during the terror of the French Revolution. So he wrote Songs of Innocence, and he thought, wait, I can't just leave it there. I have to. And these are really like almost children's poems, but children's poems not for children. A, they wouldn't get it, and B, they're kind of like, some of them are kind of scary, right, and weird, right? They wouldn't get it, and they're kind of scary and weird. Like if you look at some of the poems like A Sick Rose or whatever, they just terrify children, they're about death and things like that, right? But the point is that he saw that Songs of Innocence wasn't enough, and he needed Songs of Experience to balance it. And so then what he began to do is to take some of the poems that he had written and think about them as opposites. So what I gave you to read, and I want you to make sure you read this, like, let me make this clear. Stuff that is in the packets, even if I don't talk about it or say it at all, is fair game for quizzes, for midterms, whatever. It's not a lot of reading, so I would just want you to make sure you read it at least and get familiarized yourself with it a little bit. So the Lamb and the Tiger. The tiger is Blake's most famous poem. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what a mortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry. It's like the most famous of his poems. But they represent two different sides of the same question. The question is the same question they ask, I guess, in catechism. I'm not Catholic, but I think they ask you questions like who made the world and all these kinds of, right? Who made us, right? And the answer, is God made the lamb and God made the tiger, right? So you could sort of say, okay, who made sunshine? Okay, God. Who made swine flu? Okay, God. You know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like that's what he's asking us to think. Like, who made, who made the most horrible things and who made the most beautiful things, right? All right. So the Song of Innocence and the Song of Experience. Here's the Song of Experience. My mother groaned, my father wept. Into the dangerous world I leapt. Helpless, naked, piping loud, like a fiend hid in a cloud. Struggling in my father's hands, striving against my swaddling bands. Bound and weary, I thought best to sulk upon my mother's breast. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the Song of Experience, Infant Sorrow. Find a copy. Come on. Well, I can't find the image right now. Let's just talk about the poem without the image. The image is important to look at, and you can find it. You can find it online very easily because it's very strange. It's a baby that looks almost like it's preternaturally muscled or something. It looks like kind of strangely muscled. And Blake is a strange artist in a way. Like when you look at his engravings that he does for books, other people's books, they're incredibly refined. And for some of his own books, they're incredibly refined. And then at other times, he seems like a very amateurish artist. And that's why I call him an outsider artist. I think he's absolutely purposeful. If you want to see outsider art, like visual art, if you go to collections of Southern art, there are a lot of untrained artists, usually poor people, who make this amazing art, right? Really amazing, very, very decorative, very strange. Like there's a great museum in New Orleans that I saw called Art of the South. It has all this what I would call outsider art, right? So it's naive, it's not skilled, it's almost purposely de-skilled, and it kind of is more kind of like, for that reason, more kind of, gets you. Like this was the driving force behind punk rock. It wasn't that we want to play bad. No, we played good. We didn't want to play smooth. We don't want to play clean. We wanted to go against what was on the radio, which was crap. We wanted to do stuff that was like cut through, right? It was real. Not a bunch of cocaine, whatever, and guys singing as high as they could, no, and long guitar solos, no. We want to boom, 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 get in, get out, tell the truth. Tell the truth. That's what outsider art really tries to do, is tell the truth. And Blake is really about, let me tell the truth, right? So that's how I would explain it. Okay, so let's talk about this poem. I'm gonna let you guys comment for a couple minutes now, because we're approaching the end of the hour. What about this poem? How is it, what's its relation to infant joy? How's it the same, how's it different? Yeah.
I think this kind of goes more on like the experience side of
it. It is a song of experience.
Yeah, because it even is like describing the experience rather than the other one is just more of like nailing the innocence of it.
Yeah.
I definitely see them as related though.
Yes, very good. Can I ask you a question? It's Jacob, yeah?
Yeah.
Is there a conversation going on?
I'd say so, yeah.
Well, who's responding? Isn't it one voice?
Maybe.
I think so. I think it's more one voice than a conversation. I just wanted to sort of highlight the fact that there's a kind of dialogic quality to innocence, where I talk, you listen, you talk, I listen, and in experience, very often it's like one person just holding forth. Yes.
The language used is also different.
Yes.
The type of language you switch from using a lot of words like happy, joy, sweet, and you immediately jump into like dangerous, wept, helpless, naked, sulk.
Yes.
He's just really emphasizing
Yes.
the sorrow instead of kind of making it a happy, innocent place. It's also shorter.
It's also shorter. It may almost be the same amount, like if we were to count syllables, it might almost be the same syllables, but they're just so compressed into, these are called heroic quatrains, and they're tetrameter lines that rhyme A-A-B-B, A-A-B-B, like that. What else? Somebody farther back? What do you think? How is it like or different? Yes.
In the second poem, it rhymes a whole lot more. In the first one, he rhymes smile and while, but that's really it. All else he really says is like ye. And,
Yes.
And in the second one, you have wept, leapt, loud, cloud, hands, bands, best, breast, like the whole thing like rhymes like all the way through consistently.
Right. I will say, I think you're absolutely right. I simply want to say in the first poem, when we're talking about rhyme, we have to be really clear that there are forms of rhyme that are here that
like not at the end, but like halfway through.
Or what are called I rhymes, like am and name are an I rhyme, like they look really similar. But you see what is required here. It's complicated. Like in innocence, it's okay to have a kind of more complicated message. In experience, it's all bad. It's all bad. This is the way I feel many mornings if I read the newspaper. It's just like, I'm in experience, it's bad, it's all bad. And it has that rhymey-chimey feel of like certainty. I know it's all bad. Yes.
What about like in Infant Sorrow it says it seems like he's just entering the world, whereas
Yes.
the other one it says he's 2 days old.
It's 2 days old. So it could be the same baby.
Right.
It could be the same baby before it experiences the mother's love and it's turned into, this could be joy, right? Just entering in. It doesn't feel like it, but it could be. Yeah, that's a great point. The other point about it is that joy doesn't judge. So if innocence doesn't judge, and that almost to a point of all experience doesn't judge. So why does the mother groan? What? Childbirth. Yeah. Right? How can you do this to me? It's like so much pain, right? But it's completely natural. It's not. He interprets it as bad. Or she. I'm making him a he. I don't know why. Does he say he? No. I always make this baby a he. It looks like it's a he. I think you don't see a penis, but I think. It's all bad. My father wept. He wept because he's happy. Can't believe the joy of this baby being born. It's like into the dangerous world I left. You gotta push you out. It's the only way you get out. You'll stay in there if you don't get pushed, right? Helpless, naked. Well, of course you're naked. You couldn't get any clothes in there. Like everything. Some days this is my kids. It's like, what's the matter? I'm tired. You slept a lot. Oh, it's sunny. Yeah, it's sunny. Kids are experienced, right? That's it. So every single thing, struggling in my father's hands, that's just like loving, right? Swaddling is supposed to be a good thing for a baby, but it feels like binding up or being trapped here. To suck upon my mother's breast is the way experience is, in fact, being fed and being nursed. So all of these feel that. So it's two related ways of looking at the same phenomenon, innocence and experience. I didn't get a chance to look at the other poems. Take a look at the Charlotte Smith poem. We'll probably return to that, but also I have poems for you for next week. I'll hand them out. Get a start on Frankenstein. I don't really care. I'm not super picky about which edition you use as long as it's the 1815 edition. Don't get the 1831 edition. She revises it and puts in a bunch of stuff in the 1831. I prefer the 1815 or 1817. The first edition turned better. You're going to leave?
No.
Oh. All right, and before you go and have a wonderful weekend, I just want to remind you that even though we're in a space where you're like farther from me, please don't text or look at your phones during class because I find it to be distracting. All right, so that's just my loving way of saying goodbye to you.